Well, wow, what a night. What an introduction. Every part of it except for that Cowboys jab. I think I'm going to stab Peter with those gigantic scissors later. And it is so good to be with you. And I need you to know something. I am standing and you are sitting in a miracle. And I hope you know that. Like, this is the answer to so many prayers and so much blood, sweat, and tears that God has done an amazing thing. And tonight we're here to celebrate it. We're here to dedicate it. And I believe it's going to be a special night. But here's my hope. I don't want you to miss what God is doing. A few years ago, I made a huge mistake. I learned a lesson. The experts say that when you fast, and if you've never fasted before, fasting is when you go without food or something to draw closer to God. And so for 7 full days, I did a fast, only water 7 days. And experts say that after a fast, you should have one very small meal for every day you fasted. And so that means they want me to have 7 small, like, fruit-only meals. But your boy don't play like that. And so 7 full days of nothing but water, and my wife and I decided to end my fast by going to Carrabba's. And that's how I roll. And so we go to Carrabba's, and if you've ever fasted, usually day 1 is terrible, day 2 is worse. But by day 3, the hunger kind of subsides and you're fine. And so 3, 4, and 5 were fine, but day 6, when you know you're going to eat tomorrow, the hunger comes back even worse. And so by day 7, we go to Carrabba's, and I'm so hungry. And I order my food, and the soup comes out. It's minestrone soup as the appetizer, and I'm so excited. I've got the first bite in my hand. My hand is trembling, and my wife goes, "Hold on 1 second." And I said, "I've held on for 7 days. That's a lot of seconds." She goes, "What do you mean?" And she goes, "No, I just want to say something." And her eyes welled up with tears. And she says, I just love you so much. And while she's saying this, she gets emotional, and I take the bite of soup, and I can't explain to you what happened, but her eyes well with tears. You don't know us. I'll tell you some of our story later, but we've walked through some stuff together. Walked through cancer, the loss of a child, some crazy stuff together. And so when she says, "I love you," it's not like, 2 19-year-olds who are just in love with being in love. That she actually, loves me. And so she says this, and I don't know why, but after she says this, there's this awkward moment of silence, and my brain shut off. And the only words that came out of my mouth after this were, "I love this soup so much." Two lessons. Lesson number 1, guys can be idiots. Can I get a good amen? Okay, yeah. Lesson 2, it is possible to be in a moment and to miss the moment. It's possible to be somewhere physically, but not to be there. And I don't want you to miss this. I don't want you to miss this moment, because God has done something special, and it's not the finish line, it's the starting line for all that God has for you. Tonight I want to talk to you about what that looks like. I want to talk to you about how we can celebrate the faithfulness of God and to see it as a launching pad for all that God has for us. Can I pray for you, and then we'll get to work? God, thank you. Thank you for this time. Thank you for this place. Thank you for this space. God, my prayer is that this church, that this building will be a beacon of light to the hundreds of thousands of people within driving distance. God, thank you for your blessing. Thank you for your faithfulness. We return everything back as praise to you. We worship you in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. 2 years ago, this exact week, I had one of the coolest surprises of my life. My wife surprised me. She came into my office with one of my best friends who works on staff with me, and she said, "Your birthday is next week, and we wanted to surprise you with something." Now, 2 years ago, we were kind of coming out of the pandemic, and everything was still kind of weird, and travel wasn't really happening, and I love to travel. I love the world. I've been all over the world. And she goes, "You've just been so sad about not traveling, so for your 40th birthday, I have a gift for you. I want to send you and Ryan on an adventure trip to Iceland together." And it was amazing. If you've never been to Iceland, put it on your bucket list. Everything was beautiful and covered in snow. It was incredible. This is a picture that I took on the side of the road. The next picture is a picture of me and my friend Ryan. It was freezing. It was amazing. Like, I'm from Florida. We don't know what to do with this. And it was incredible. One of my favorite moments was we went to this place. It was a glacier that was on top of a volcano. And so it was just this awesome thing. So I decided to celebrate it by doing a handstand on it. And I just wanted to show you that. I just wanted to show that I was 40 and I could still do that, everybody. It was amazing. There was a lot of fun moments in the trip. Ate a lot of weird food. Ate fermented shark. 0 stars. Do not recommend that. Also ate reindeer, surprisingly good. Sorry, Santa. It was good. It was amazing. But maybe the highlight of the trip for me was we went to this ice cave on the southern tip of Iceland. This was me going down into it. And then we get to this place where you're literally surrounded by ice. The next picture is me surrounded by ice. Our tour guide was this incredible guy from Barcelona, and in this beautiful Spanish accent, he says, this ice is 800 years old. There was this lady behind me, she goes, how do you know it's 800 years old? And he walked over to the ice and he said, how old are you? And he put his ear up to it, so funny. You'll get that later. The last day of the trip, we went to this place that's very famous in Iceland called the Blue Lagoon. It's a geothermal spa. And while we were there, it was beautiful. The water was warm, but everything above it was so cold. And when we left, we get in the car, and all of a sudden, it starts like torrential snowing. Now, we're from Florida. We don't know how to do this, right? Like, if it gets below 45 or 50 degrees, we put salt on the roads just in case. Like, we don't know what to do with this. And so we get in the car, and over the radio, there's like a siren that sound through the radio, and they say, ladies and gentlemen, Iceland is in a code orange storm. I don't know what that means. I don't know what any of those words mean. And so we start driving, and it's the most torrential snow I've ever seen. You could not see more than 10 or 15 feet in front of you. The only way to drive was to drive along the tire tracks that you could see and hope that nobody stepped on their brakes. It was crazy. Finally, by the grace of God, we make it back to the hotel, and as I was getting out of the door, I noticed that my side mirror looked like this. And I had this thought. I wonder if this is how many of us tend to live our lives. We can't really see that far ahead because we're so cloudy with confusion. There's chaos in our lives. And in those moments, it's hard for us to look in the side or the rear view mirrors and to see and remember the faithfulness of God. Tonight, my hope is really one thing. I just want to help you to remember the faithfulness of God. And to do that, I want to use a simple analogy for tonight. I want to teach you what it means to stack some stones. All throughout Scripture, there are moments where God instructs people to build an altar. An altar is this really fascinating thing. We don't really talk about altars much anymore, but altars are simply this. An altar is a symbol from the past that gives meaning to the present and that gives us faith for the future. All throughout Scripture, God instructs people to do it. And there's always a story that's connected to a point. Genesis chapter 22. God speaks to a man named Abraham. If you're a church person, you've heard of Abraham. God speaks to Abraham, and he says, Abraham, I want to ask you to do something that doesn't make sense. I want you to take your son, your only son whom you love. I want you to walk up the side of Mount Moriah, and when you get to the top, I want you to build an altar, and I want you to sacrifice your son on the altar. This makes no sense. I have 3 kids. You could never convince me to do what he does. In Genesis 22, verse 3, the next verse says, the next morning, Abraham got up and he saddled his donkey and he brought his son and he goes up the mountain. He builds the altar. He lays his son on it. He probably takes the deepest gulp of his life. And before he does it, God stops him and says, no, I have a different way. I wanted to test you. In this moment that made no sense, the beautiful picture of God is this altar reminds us that God can be trusted. God can be trusted. I don't know if you've ever had a moment in your life where God didn't make a lot of sense, but in the end, he came through and he reminded you that you can trust him. Just a few chapters later, 2 generations later, we meet a guy named Jacob. Jacob's a young man with a troubled past, and he's on the run for his life. And there's a moment where he lays down, he lays his head down on a rock, and he falls asleep. And as he's asleep, he's awoken by God. And there's this interesting moment in Genesis chapter 28 where he's wrestling with God. He has this divine moment with God. And he wakes up the next morning and he says, I got to do something about this. I've got to build some sort of symbolic way to remember this moment. And he builds an altar and he says, if I ever come back to this moment, I'll be reminded that God is real and he's good. He named the place El Bethel. It means the house of God. And he builds an altar there. Later, 7 chapters later, Genesis 35, he comes back to the place where he had built the altar, and he was reminded that God is not just trustworthy, but God can be encountered. I think for a lot of us, we have an intellectual relationship with God, know a lot about him, but your relationship with God will come alive when you realize that you can trust him, and he's a God who wants to be known and encountered. A few books later, 1 Kings chapter 18, we meet Elijah. He's the greatest of all time. He's the GOAT prophet. And there's a moment where God says to Elijah, gather up your courage and go stand before the king and queen and tell them that I'm disappointed, I'm angry in the way that they're leading the people away from God. We're going to prove once and for all that I'm the true God. And so Elijah does this. He gathers up all of his courage and he goes to the king and queen. They set up a contest. They said, what we're going to do is we're going to build altars on Mount Carmel. And you're going to pray to your God, the fake God. And you're going to ask him to send down fire from heaven, and if he's real, he'll do it. So the people meet a couple days later on Mount Carmel. They build altars. The prophets of Baal cry out to God and their God, and nothing happens. Then Elijah builds an altar. Through a whole series of moments, he proves that God is going to come through. He prays a simple prayer. God sends fire from heaven and burns up his offering. In this moment, he proved that God can not just be trusted and encountered, but God is powerful. Every single one of these altars are moments where we remember God's faithfulness to us. But today, I want to end with another reason that altars matter so much. And then I want to have a moment as a church where we build a collective altar to God and we remember his faithfulness. You see, in this last altar, we're reminded that God, it's not just a God who can be trusted and encountered and who's powerful, but we're reminded that God is faithful. In the book of Joshua, there's this fascinating moment. Joshua follows one of the greatest leaders to ever live, a guy named Moses. I don't know if you've ever studied leadership, but following a great leader is incredibly, incredibly hard. Who was the president after Abraham Lincoln? Exactly, right? Like, nobody knows, right? It's just hard to follow an incredible leader. So Moses lives and Moses dies. Joshua chapter 1, verse 1, God shows up to Joshua, and he says to Joshua, he goes, Joshua, Moses, my servant, your leader, he's dead. He's gone. And I need you to rise up and lead. But 4 times in in Joshua chapter 1, 4 times he says to Joshua, fear not. Why do you think God says fear not? Joshua's afraid. He didn't want to do this. That's Joshua chapter 1. By Joshua chapter 6, there's this moment. If you grew up in Sunday school, the only story that people tend to know about Joshua is Joshua circling the walls of Jericho. But between Joshua 1 and Joshua chapter 6, there was a whole bunch of living, and there's a moment that is so powerful where God reminds Joshua and all the people of Israel that he is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and that he's trustworthy, he can be encountered, he's powerful, but ultimately that he is faithful. Here's Joshua chapter 3, verse 5. Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. Joshua is living in the middle of his encounter with God in chapter 1, and what's going to happen in Jericho, but he's led the people that Moses could not lead to the promised land towards this place, and to get to the promised land, there was a river in front of them called the Jordan River. Then they'd have to get through Jericho, and then they get to the promise of God. So Joshua says, here's what I want you to do. Consecrate yourself, which means get your heart ready. Purify yourself, because God's going to show up and do something. Now, here's what you need to know. The people of Israel had heard stories of their ancestors that God led out of slavery and captivity in Egypt. They had heard the stories of their grandparents and their great-grandparents of how God led them, and he opened up the Red Sea so the people could walk across it. They had never experienced it for themselves. So Joshua says, God's going to do something amazing, so get yourself ready. Skip down a few verses to verse 17. It says, the priest who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan. So here's what's happened. Joshua said God's going to do something, and God shows up. He parts the Jordan Sea, the Jordan River. The people start walking across it on dry ground, just like the previous generations had. The priest who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground, while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed crossing on dry ground. God came through. Next verse says this. When all the people crossed the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, now choose 12 men, 1 from each tribe. Tell them, take 12 stones from the very place where the priests are standing, which is in the middle of the Jordan River. He said, take 12 stones from the very place where the priests are standing in the middle of the Jordan, carry them out, and pile them up at the place where you will camp tonight. Why would he do this? The verse goes on to say this. The people crossed the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month. Then they camped at Gilgal, just east of Jericho. It was there at Gilgal that Joshua piled up the 12 stones taken from the Jordan River. Then Joshua said to the Israelites, here's why, and I want you to get this. In the future, your children will ask, what do these stones mean? Then you can tell them, this is where the Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry ground. It was to serve as a reminder. The verse goes on, for the Lord your God dried up the river right before your eyes, and he kept it dry until you were all across, just as he did the Red Sea when it dried up until all had crossed over. He did this so that all the nations of the earth might know the Lord's hand is powerful, so you might fear or honor the Lord your God forever. He said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take some stones from the middle of this river, and we're going to stack them up. And the reason we're going to stack them up is there's going to be a day, someday, when your kids and your kids' kids and your kids' grandkids come back to this place and they see it, and you tell them the story that those stones used to be in the middle of the river, but God came through for his people. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And if he's been faithful, he will be faithful. Here's what I want you to understand. Altars remind us that God who did it before, he can do it again, and he can do it again and again. So this is my story, and this is your story. This is the story of Hope City. What I'd like to do is I'd like to tell you some stories from my life that are altar moments, but let me preface it with this. A few weeks ago, the man who was my pastor passed away, kind of sad. He died at 83 years old, incredible life. There was this huge funeral for him. Lots and lots of people came out. And they asked a few people who had really been impacted by him to share their stories. And so one of the first men to get up and share their stories told stories about himself for like 15 or 20 minutes. And at the end, he's like, oh, by the way, it's all thanks to Pastor. And he walked off the stage. Okay, I don't want to do that, but I don't know all of your stories. So what I want to do is I want to tell you the stories of God's faithfulness in my life. And here's what I know. A lot of the stories of God's faithfulness to me parallel the stories of Hope City Church. Got married 19 years ago. You just heard Peter tell our story a little bit. I married an amazing Italian girl named Liz. When we got married, we had no idea what we were doing. We just knew that God had a plan and a call for our lives. 6 months into marriage, my wife was doing her makeup one day, leaned up against the counter, and she felt a little bump in her leg. She didn't think anything of it. She was 23 years old, in perfect health otherwise. She went to the doctor. One test led to another, which led to another. And she got the call. I'll never forget where I was. I was out preaching at a camp in North Texas. Her phone rings. She gets really stiff. She answers, says hello, and I can overhear the doctor say, Liz, I am so sorry. We did the test, and it came back as cancer. 6 months married. 6 months into marriage, she started chemo. 7 or 8 months into marriage, she shaved her head. I'll never forget, I was doing a camp teaching kids about the love of God. I took a flight one day early to come home to be with her. I get home, she's gone through all the tests. They put a PICC line in her arm because the next day she was going to start chemo. And we sat down on the couch when I got home. I put my hands around her, and we prayed the single most impacting prayer of our lives. We prayed, God, we don't understand, but we trust you. She went through chemo. It was brutal, and it was hard. But we look back, and we remember God's faithfulness in that season. There's so much in our story of our church that exists because of the moments that she had to walk through. The love you feel when you come to our church is because we know what it's like to be cared for. The concern we have for people when they walk through dark and difficult days is because we remember what it was like to sit there trembling, holding each other, praying that prayer. A few years later, we had 2 boys, and it was the best time of our life. Our 2 boys were the highlight of our life. And everything was good, and everything was fun, and we were kind of moving on, and we had this thought, we're done having kids. We're going to settle in. This is going to be our life. And then there was that moment my wife came to me, and she's holding a stick, and she looked nervous. She's trembling. She's like, we're pregnant. It's like, girl, this is your fault. What are you talking about? And she's like, oh, yeah, we're pregnant. I'm like, I know, I told you, this is your fault. Just leave me alone. I'm more than a body, is what I told her. I was like, leave me alone. And we didn't expect to get pregnant. We weren't trying to get pregnant. A few months later, we found out it was a girl, and now we had 2 boys and a little girl on the way, and everything was going our way. We were days away from painting a room, putting together a crib, the whole deal. We had a name picked out for this little girl. And 26 weeks into pregnancy, my wife came to me. She goes, I don't feel right. Like, I'm not feeling the baby move. What is this? Go to the doctor. One test leads to another. We find out the baby's heart wasn't beating anymore. So then my heroic wife had to deliver a stillborn baby, and we had no idea what God was doing. But because God had always been faithful to us, we knew that we could look back at the altar moments of our life and remember that if he was faithful, he will be faithful to us. In the season of cancer, God spoke to us and said, I want you to do something here in the city of Lakeland that is for the city of Lakeland. And so we started a college Bible study for our friends. What we walked through in losing the baby has actually been one of the greatest stories in our life because God's used it over and over and over to help so many people. So we start not a church, but a college Bible study. And I love college students. Don't get me wrong. College students are the best. They have so much life and energy and excitement. What they don't have is money. And so start a church. It's really full of college students, and it's really hard. I like to tell the story. The first night we have service, and we're so excited about this first service, so excited to see. And people came out to it, and our whole offering, when it was all said and done, was $5. $5. Years ago, before inflation, I could make a Subway $5 footlong joke. It was literally $5. And so I was like, God, okay, you're going to have to come through. This doesn't make sense. But if you've called us to do this, we trust you. The night of our first service, not just was there only $5 in the offering, but I was the whole setup and tear down team by myself. We met in a like a civic center at first, and I set everything up by myself, and I tore everything down. When the service was over, I go out to my car, I pulled my key fob out, and I was going to unlock the car. And when you do it, like the lights inside of your car come on, and it looked to me like there was water on the glass in my car because it looked like there was just speckles of water. When I got closer, I found out that someone during that service had smashed my window, broken in, gone through all of my stuff. I had a moment with God. Did all this. We gave everything financially. We didn't have people helping us. We gave all of our money, emptied our bank account to trust God in this moment. We did all of this for you, God. And I walk out when no one could see me. You ever read the book of Psalms? Like, David's incredibly honest with God, and I just got really honest with God. It's like, God, I didn't even ask to do this. You can have this. I didn't ask you for any of this. Where are you in this moment? Let me say this to you. God encouraged us to keep going. A few months go by. And I've depleted my bank account. Our offerings were so small. And we got to the end of the month. Have you ever had this experience financially where you get to the end of the month and it feels like there's not enough money for the month? And I'll never forget the number. We were $1,186 short the night of our last service. I thought to myself, God, you're going to be faithful. God, you're going to come through. God, you will provide for us miraculously. Our biggest offering ever had been like a couple $100 total. But God's going to come through. Last service, had all this faith. Service is over. We were $1,186 short, and just a few dollars came in the offering. I'll never forget, I had this plan. The next day, I was going to go home. I was going to wait to the next day, send an email to everybody on our church mailing list and say, guys, it's been a good run. Thank you for being a part of this. Here's 5 or 6 great churches to check out. Thank you so much. It's been an honor. The next day, I go out to my mailbox. I kid you not. And in the mail, there's a letter from my mom and dad. I immediately recognized it from the handwriting. Open the letter. There's a full-page handwritten letter from my dad. 3 paragraphs. Paragraph 1, Jason, I need you to know your mom and I are so proud of you. You stepped out in faith and trusted God. Paragraph 2, he said, you are going to have cynics and critics and haters along your journey. And boy, was he right. And paragraph 3, I still have this letter in my office. He said, we were praying and God spoke to us and told us to send you a check. It was a check for $1,200. Now, that may not be a lot of money to you. It was a ton of money to my parents. My parents never had extra money, but they heard the voice of God and they were faithful and they gave. It was exactly what we needed. So now as a pastor, there are moments where I'm tempted to get worried financially. We're in the middle of a building project. Again, we have not enough money to get this thing done, but if God was faithful then, I have this holy confidence that he will be faithful now. You understand this, right? Thinking about money, I'll never forget there was a season in the early days of our church when our total giving at that time was $10,000 a month. We made a big jump from $5 a night to $10,000 a month. There was a man in our church who gave 1,000 of those dollars himself. took me to dinner one night. He goes, I need to talk to you. And he did the thing that pastors hate. He pulls out a notepad, and he had 3 pages of notes of things he was upset about. Everybody look at me. Don't do this to Peter and Tiffany, everybody. And can I tell you what he was mad about? I can't share this at my church because he still is connected to our church in some ways. He was mad because I said, like, we should be a church that's focused on reaching the lost. He's like, well, what about us? And I'm like, what about you? Good question. Like, we should care about the lost. Like, you matter, but people matter to God. Like, read the Bible. And so I had this moment where he said, listen, if we don't change this, my wife and I are going to find another church. And I had a crisis moment. 10% of our church budget could walk out the door like this, and I prayed about it. I talked to my pastors and my overseeing pastors, and they were like, let him walk. God will be faithful. So we made the decision. We said, listen, this is the call of our church. We're going to be faithful to this. He left the church. 10% of our total budget walked out when one person walked out the door. And I'll never forget the panic in my heart. How do you replace that money? What do you do in this moment? And I can't explain it to you. It was at the very beginning of the summer. All of our college students had left. There was just a few people, it felt like, left. And that summer, miraculously, nobody knew except for my wife. Miraculously, our giving doubled in the summer. You see, what you need to understand is God is trustworthy. So there are times in my life when I'm stressed about money, but I know that God's going to be faithful because he's always been faithful. In that season, our church was meeting in a YMCA. And the YMCA was hard because we met in a gymnasium. You did portable church for a good long season. You remember setting up all the chairs, all the lights, all the screens. You did all that stuff. We did it in a YMCA gymnasium. We had to sweep the floors before we could even start setting up. It was just such a difficult season. And there was one day where I got to church a little bit late, and I got there, and the parking lot was completely full of people. So many cars, and I thought, it's it. We did it. Like, we've arrived. We've made it. Revival is breaking out. And when I walked inside, I found out that, no, it wasn't for our church. The YMCA where we met had double booked our church with the Polk County Senior Adult Swim Tournaments. So, kid you not, I'm preaching in a dark gymnasium. There's lights on me, so you can't really see people's faces. But in the back corner where the door met the hallway, there was light coming in. And I'm preaching, and I look up, and there's an 80-something-year-old man standing there, arms folded, just nodding along, wearing nothing but a smile and a Speedo, everybody. I'm like, what are we doing? But God was faithful. And then 2020 happened. And every pastor in America got murdered for every single thing. Politically, socially, vaccines, masks, you name it. It was wild. Said too much for one group, not enough for other groups. How I explained it to my church years later was for a whole year, I felt like I couldn't win. Whole year. You felt this. We talked about it. Couldn't win. And I'll never forget all the things that happened that year. People who left, people who accused, people who said things about me that were categorically untrue. When it's all said and done, the only way that I could have gotten through 2020 and all that we walked through as a society and as a church is because the same God who was with me when the man left over the money, who was with me when the man was standing and smiling in the Speedo, who was with me when someone broke into my car, he was there the whole time. So let me talk to you about your church for a second. The reason this building matters is because it is an altar moment. It is a moment where we stop and we remember that the God who has been faithful in the past, he's faithful now. And if he's faithful now, he will always be faithful. Let me tell you what this means for us. It means that we get to live now with a holy confidence. This is something that I want to write about someday because there's a difference between confidence and cockiness. Cockiness is self-assuredness. Confidence is rooted in the faithfulness of our God. Let me say it to you again like this. The greatest indicator of what God will do is what he's always done. There's stuff you don't know about the last 2 years in your church. There have been difficult days. There's some stories that are to be told over the next couple of years as some things continue to play out. Here's what I need you to know. God has been faithful to Hope City Church. There was a point when it got so hard here. I thought about this on the way over, Peter. that I called your pastor and I said, hey, if you want a job, and I was serious, I wasn't joking. I was like, if you'd like to shut this whole thing down and come work with us, I'd love to work with you. We will have so much fun. Might not get anything done, but we are going to have a good time. And he prayed about it and he said, thank you, but this is where we're called. We're called. There were days when his faith had to have been shaken. There were days, I'm just going to be honest with you, there was days when the pressure and the work and the overwhelming things that he walked through candidly landed him in the hospital. Stuff you'll never know. But God is faithful. And when you walk through difficult days and difficult seasons, you need these altar moments to remind yourself that God is faithful. And if he's been faithful, he will always be faithful. So let me say it to you like this. Our faith is in the faithfulness of God. The reason we have faith is because God has always been faithful in every season. You're standing in a place, sitting in a place that is an altar. It's a reminder. Every time you walk through the doors of Hope City Church, you should take a moment and whisper a prayer of gratitude to God because it's a reminder that he has been faithful. And if he's been faithful, he will be faithful. So let me end with this tonight. So what is my part? What do I do with this? Like, we're here to celebrate. We're here to remind ourselves that God has been faithful. Thank God for this. But what is my part? I'm going to give you a strong challenge for just a moment. As a pastor, sometimes it's hard to say stuff to your church that you want to say. But I don't live here, everybody. And I'm going to go home. I stopped at Yoder's on the way and holler at your boy. I got a banana cream pie. So no matter how good or bad this goes, I'm going to eat a banana cream pie from Yoder's tonight. What is your part? I'm going to make it really simple. I want everyone in this room to make a decision tonight that we're trusting the faithfulness of God. And because we've seen the faithfulness of God, we're going to make an intentional shift. We're going to shift from being consumers at Hope City Church to contributors. We're going to make the move from being renters to being owners. What does that mean? You ever rented a hotel room? You ever notice how you treat a hotel room? I used to travel with my brother, and at hotel rooms, he would pick what he called a trash corner. Trash corner was like, there's trash cans around, but he's like, they pay people to pick this up. He would throw his trash in a corner. You treat something you rent differently than something you feel ownership over, don't you? You understand this? I want you to take a personal sense of ownership over it. Let's just give a couple quick examples. This building, it's a testimony of God's faithfulness. It's a reminder that God has been good. But now we get to be stewards over it. Told you a moment ago, every time you walk in the doors, remind yourself of God's faithfulness. But how about this? How about now that God has blessed us and he's been faithful, how about we use this building for what God gave it to you for? What did he give it to you for? To reach Sarasota for Jesus. On the way in, I had this thought. I was like, I wonder how many people are in Sarasota. There's a little over, in the Sarasota metro area, there's a little over 833,000 people. Quick math. Statistically, about 19% of people in this area consider themselves Christians. That leaves 675,000 people in this area that are your friends, your neighbors, your barista, your kid's soccer coach, your kid's teachers. There's this many people, 675,000 who are far from God, who, if they were to die tonight, would spend eternity away from God. That's a big number. It's a little hard to imagine. I want to give you one quick picture of what it looks like. If you were to take 675,000 people within driving distance of this church, we were to start right here, we were to make a single file line, one person in front of the next. If each person took just one linear foot of space, how long do you think the line of 675,000 people would be? Let me kind of illustrate it for you. The line would start right here. It would go out the doors, go out into your parking lot. It would take the road that gets you to I-75. Imagine leaving here tonight and getting in your car and driving slowly and seeing people lined up toe to heel, heel to toe from here to the road. That's a lot of people. But it would go all the way to the road, all the way to I-75, and then you'd get on the ramp of 75 and you'd start going north. Imagine driving very slow and catching eyes with every one of the people on the road. The line would go north. You would drive through Bradenton, past the Ellenton outlets. You'd keep driving north. You'd drive through all the little suburbs of the Brandon area. And eventually you'd make all the way to I-4. That's a long drive from here. But then you would turn right to go east on I-4, and there would still be people in line from Sarasota. And the line would keep going. It would go from the Brandon area to the Valrico area to Plant City. You'd stop off in Lakeland and say, what's up to me where I live, and you keep going. And the line would keep going. It would go through Celebration in Davenport. It would go into the Disney area, and it keeps going. It would literally go all the way through downtown. If you've ever driven to, like, from here to Orlando, you know how miserable it is? I-4, I think hell is going to be I-4. And at the end of I-4 is Chuck E. Cheese. That is hell, everybody. But imagine driving very slow and catching eyes with every person. You'd make it through Lakeland. You'd make it into Orlando. You'd make it past Disney. You'd make it past downtown. You ever gone to Universal Studios? You know that stretch between Disney and Universal feels like it takes about 7 days to drive that far? And you would keep going 10 miles past Universal Studios of people from your area in line, toe to heel, heel to toe, all the way out. 675,000 people, 1 linear foot each is 128 miles long. God gave you this building. Don't you dare get selfish and keep this for yourself. Second thing I need you to do is I need you to pray about turning the dial when it comes to giving. This is a big deal, and I wish everyone was here to hear this. But God blesses us, not for us, but God blesses us to be a blessing. God doesn't give us stuff so that we can hold on tightly. He gives us stuff so that we can hold on with open hands. The greatest investment you can make is not in a 401k, it's not in private equity, it's not in the stock market, it's not in crypto. The greatest investment a person can make is the building of a local church. Here's my challenge to you. Whatever you do when it comes to giving, I'm going to ask you to go home and pray about, say, God, what are you asking me to do? And just turn the dial. Some of you, like, you don't give anything. Turn the dial and start somewhere. Others of you, you are faithful givers, but you give something like $50 whenever you show up or whenever you think about it. Thank God for that. Turn the dial. Some of you are like me. You've been tithing your whole life. That's not the finish line. What if you made the decision to say, God, listen, as you continue to bless me, I'll continue to give. Final thing is this. I want to challenge you to see your pastors a little bit differently. You have no idea the sacrifice, the work, the investment. You have no idea what it's taken to get to this place. You don't. Can I tell you one of the greatest days of my life? Our church was portable, like you were. We didn't have a building for 13 years. Some people are like, oh, that's awesome, you're a hero. I'm like, no, that's stupid. That's what that is. And about 5 years into it, I was the leader. I was the first one to set up, first one to be tearing down. I'd bring clothes to change into before and after church. The sweetest sound ever in my life was when a person came up to me and they said, Pastor Jason, you don't need to be doing this. Why don't you go do something else? Let me take this for you. I said to myself, I will kiss you on the mouth right now. Like, there are things that you can do and there's things that you can take off of your pastors that will free them up to do stuff that you can't even begin to imagine. There's things that you can do for them to bless them that will mean the world to them. What if you made this decision that on your prayer list, you pray for your pastors? You have no idea the spiritual battle that they face every single day. You have no idea the sacrifice that they've made. That there's some stuff, like, you need to bless them any chance you get. Like, go out of your way. Scripture teaches that a pastor is worthy of double honor. A faithful pastor is worthy of double honor. And you've got two of the best, two of the most faithful, gifted leaders in Pastor Peter and Tiffany. Honor them, bless them. Let me tell you what will happen. When you do, God will pour out his blessing on you as well. I'm going to pray in a minute over you, but here's how I thought we should end tonight. If it's cool with you, I'd like to end with that point. I'd like to pray and honor your pastors. And so would you guys mind? Would you come up here? And kids, would you come up as well? I want to pray a blessing over you. If there's any of the pastors or leaders in this room too, I'd love to end with this. Pastor Mark, would you join us too?